It's heading east.
Right.
Those were the days when you did real printing in the darkroom with an enlarger.
Will we get started then, Rod?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can get it going now.
Yeah, can you enable screen sharing for me, please?
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
I think you should be able
There we go.
to
Yeah.
now.
Okay. So just before I get into screen sharing and I lose the ability to see everybody, so quick show of hands. Who uses Lightroom at the minute? Just hands up.
Lightroom.
So a few people who use Monique uses Lightroom, good, and Vivian's getting good.
And I do as well.
Who uses something else other than Lightroom? Some other post-processing software. Trevor uses, and Frank, Photoshop users there, I would guess.
Yes.
I use Photoshop Element and just starting with Photoshop.
Right. Okay. Yep. But not Lightroom.
Well, I started with Lightroom. Yes, a little bit of Lightroom and then got to Photoshop. Still early days for me.
Early days. Yeah. Well, I think there's a big span of some regular users, some people who will know a lot about Lightroom and probably more than me, and some curious and some getting started. So hopefully there's something for everyone. If you don't understand what I'm saying, or I'm going too quickly, or you can't see what I'm doing, please interrupt and say. But otherwise, probably best with microphones muted. So let's get into Lightroom.
Yeah.
Here.
You could all mute Sarah.
Yeah, hold on.
Right. So is everyone seeing Lightroom with the seashell at sunset?
Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I think the first thing that you're going to need to do is I've got a film strip of people's videos down on the right-hand side of my screen. And you're going to need to move that over somewhere that isn't the right-hand side, because all of the controls I'm going to be using in Lightroom are there, and you're going to want to see what I'm doing. So I'm pulling that film strip over to the left-hand side, and I'm clicking the minimize icon, so it goes away. Does that make sense?
You could actually enlarge the screen share.
I've got it's I'm on maximized on my desktop. So the key thing is that people can see the panel. So there's a histogram and then there's some controls and things on the right hand side. You're going to want to be able to see those because I'm going to be doing a lot with those controls.
Okay.
All right, we can see them.
Okay, cool.
So just quickly, for the benefit of people who don't use Lightroom, can you show the library function and show how photos can be grouped?
I can.
Because I think it's one of the good things about it is that you can group stuff. And
it is. Yes, let's do that very quickly. I did that. I did a session on Lightroom a couple of years ago now, and I spent a lot of time in the library, but it's good reminder, always good to start there. So as you can see over on the left-hand side now, I've got a whole load of folders of pictures. And so if I click on this Tollsbury, there's some pictures that we took on, Janet and I took on a photo day. And then there's other things, that's photos that I used for the workshop last time around. So I've got it all set up in folders, and there's a sort of structure that I went through last time. I don't want to do too much more on it this time because there's quite a lot to cover. But in this folder, you can now see the thumbnails of the pictures that I'm going to go through this time. I want to get into the develop module, partly because that's where a lot of the power of Lightroom is, partly because that's the bit when people say that Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw can do the same thing. They're talking about the develop module in Lightroom. And as you can see from the top right menus, then there are a number of other modules in Lightroom. I use Lightroom because of the library module and because of its ability to organize pictures for me. It helps me keep my pictures organized. And so I use Lightroom rather than Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop predominantly. And I'll probably cover more as we get through it. So I think there's about 5 pictures I want to go through today. Initially, I was going to talk about here's how you do the masking and here's how you use the various sorts of masks. But it seemed to make sense to actually put it in the context of processing photos. And we'll get through all of the masking and we'll get through some color management and we'll get through other things. And hopefully at the end of it, we'll have a set of photos that are ready for export and submission for a challenge or whatever. So I thought I'd use it in the context of the complete or my photo processing workflow. It's definitely not the only processing workflow, but I think there's a logic to it and it works for me most of the time. So let's jump into develop and get back to our seashell photo. So this is, it's a piece of art on a beach that's nearby us, and we went and took pictures at sunset. And whilst it's other people's art, I think that I've got sufficient creativity and done something with it that it's worth pulling through and worth spending a bit of time developing. So picture is in the middle of the screen on the right. Then if I just collapse this panel here, you can see that there's a whole load of control panels, and I can open up one at a time or the ones that I need to use. I have Lightroom set up so that when I open one panel, or if I have a panel open and I open a second panel, then you'll see that basic has collapsed. So I can only see one at a time, because otherwise the screen just gets very long and it's hard to find what I'm looking for. Above the headers for the panels, then most importantly, you can see the histogram, which gives the range of tones in the image from the darkest tones represented on the left-hand side of the histogram to the brightest tones on the right-hand side. And you'll see that, so this image has some quite dark tones in there, but there's a bit of gap in the brightest tones. And so I'll be conscious of that and be thinking about, for maximum contrast, I'll want to have all the tones all the way up to the very brightest within there. Below that, there's a set of options, and we'll get into some of these things. This is masking here, and this is the healing or the remove tools and cropping, and we'll get into those in just a minute. But before I start twiddling with exposures on any picture, then I will always come down to the lens correction panel here. And as Trevor touched on last month, then there's 2 important checkboxes to tick on really every single photo that you do in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and that's remove the chromatic aberration, so any fringing and the high contrast areas between dark and bright, and then enable profile corrections for the lens. And when I click on this tick box, you'll see the picture will just suddenly, it's like it's been deformed, warped a little bit, as Lightroom applies a set of corrections for distortions and vignetting in the lens. So here we go, click. And you could just see, hopefully, the picture move a little bit. and you'll see that Lightroom's picked up that this was shot on a Tamron lens, and this is the profile that it's used. Whilst I'm seeing here, and particularly if I zoom in on this picture, then you can just see that there's a little bit of noise in this image, and so there's some graininess in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opportunity to use the denoise facility in Lightroom to produce a version of this image that has the noise taken out. And so I've gone into the details panel, and you'll see noise reduction, and there's a denoise button here. So I can click that, and Lightroom does a bit of thinking, and then it comes up and it says, okay, you can click and hold to, this is the preview of what it will be like denoised. It's not chosen a great piece because I think it's in the very foreground, and so it's a little bit out of focus. But you can just see the denoise that it's applying. So it doesn't take long. I'll just click on the enhance, and Lightroom will now process this picture and produce a version that that's without the sensor noise. And so if I zoom in again, you'll see that a lot of that noise has now gone. So that's the first things to do. The next thing is a bit unusual because on this picture, you'll see that because I'm standing with my back to the coastline, so the sea is behind me, I'm looking at the back of this seashell, and you'll see that there's some writing etched through the seashell, but it's mirror imaged. So I want to flip the photo so that we're not spending time trying to work out what that writing is saying. So photo, flip horizontal, and it's exactly the same composition, hasn't really changed the composition, but you can now read what the writing says. So that's really sort of set up before I've twiddled anything on exposure or any of the shadows or highlights or any of that. So that's step one. So step two then for me is coming into the basic panel and looking at the exposure or the tone settings here and the presence settings to get them right across the picture. So all of the changes that I make here and now are affecting everywhere on the picture. So if I change the exposure slider, then you'll see I've changed the exposure everywhere by far too much. So we'll undo that. So I do want to lift the exposure up a bit because I want a bit more detail in the foreground. And also I do want to do a little bit with the contrast and to sort of fill that gap right there for the very brightest tones. So if we lift the exposure up perhaps to about here, and then if we can take the shadows down. Yep. Oops, here we go. So we slide the shadows down a bit. So you can see that the histogram's moving towards the left-hand side now. So we'll do that. And we'll pick up the whites and we'll close a bit more of the gap on the right-hand side. So that's reasonable. And what I'd like to do is, because of the pebbly beach here, it's a good idea to pull up the texture to start to emphasize that, and also the clarity, which helps bring in a bit more contrast into the image. And you can see that the metal of the shell changes as I move that clarity slider. So again, don't want to go overboard with it, but there's a reasonable start. And in fact, I might have a bit more on that.
Yes.
So I've just lifted the exposure up a bit more. Is there a question on what I've done so far? No, let's crack on.
My only comment, Dave,
Mhm.
is you do your preparation of denoise and lens correction. Personally, I also take sharpening down to 0 at this stage and do sharpening at the end, because if there's
Okay.
any sharpening artifacts, the subsequent processing can exaggerate them.
Yeah, I tend to leave. I definitely do sharpening at the end, and I'll come back to that, Trevor. Okay.
Yeah, but the default in Lightroom and in Photoshop is to actually include a bit of sharpening. So I
Yeah.
always whack that sharpening out before I start.
Okay.
I don't know why it includes it, but
It does. I will come on to sharpening in a bit. It is a good point. I don't find it too distracting with the defaults. But yeah, good point. So we've done some global tones and we've got the basics right. But one of the consequences of increasing the exposure is the sky is now much too bright in this picture. So we're now going to get into what you'll hear called local adjustments. And to do those, we'll use masking. So we'll click on the masking button, and this allows us to select parts of the picture and make changes like we've just done with the exposure, but only to specific parts. Masking is one of the places where Adobe have really put a lot of work in over the last few years. And it used to be that there were only linear gradients, radial gradients, and a brush in there. But now they've added a whole lot more, including detecting people, detecting sky, and all sorts of options within that. So I am going to get into taking the sky exposure down first. But I just want to explain about the adjustments with gradients, and it's probably easiest if I pick a radial gradient and just draw a circle on here. So I've gone radial gradient and I've clicked and dragged out for a circle. And what I'm going to do first is, so there are adjustments for all of the masks that you do here. You'll see that the image has gone black and white, and where I've got my mask is now a solid red circle. That's not the default with Lightroom, but it's the way I prefer it because it makes it easier for me to see where the mask is being applied. So you'll see down the bottom here, it says overlay mode. The default for Lightroom is color overlay. So if you're doing masking yourself, you may well find it looks like this. I prefer to change the image. So it's doing that. The red circle is showing where the mask will be applied. And you'll see that with it set at the minute, then it's a very hard edge. So if I drop the exposure on this, you see that the only part of the image that's being changed is where I've put in my mask. And you'll see that it's a very hard edge. So it goes from being, now very underexposed to being very overexposed in the sky. You can change that with the feather. And you see I was moving the slider here, or when you come back to the range mask, you see there's a red dot. I can slide that red dot, and the slider over on the right hand side also moves. And so I can take that all the way down, and now I have a good gradation between the darkest areas, and it gradually moves to being out of focus, properly exposed or overexposed even. So I just wanted to show that each of the masks has a portion of adjustment in there, and there's ways of adjusting and refining all of the masks similar to the way I've done with the radial gradient. So let's delete that mask because we don't want that. So I clicked on, so you see that when my masking panel here, and I have the 3 dots beside mask 1. I click on those and I can then do delete mask 1, and that's now gone. So let's get back to it and we'll click on sky. And so Lightroom thinks for a minute or two, and then we've gone black and white again, and it's gone red where Lightroom has detected sky. And you'll see it's done a pretty good job of doing that, but there's some gaps in the shell and it hasn't detected those. So one of the first things to do is to fill in those gaps, because they will look very odd if I reduce the exposure in the sky, but then there'll be some very bright sections coming through the shell here. So I can add to my mask, and it says what do you want to add with, and I'm just going to add with a brush. And so it's given me a brush I can move around, so I can just click and paint in there. And yeah, it's overflowing into the bits of shell, but the shell's dark anyway. And so it doesn't really matter. I don't need to be too precise. But I can do that. And then, you know, I can, if I hold down the Alt key, you'll see my brush goes from a plus to a minus. So I can go into subtract, and I can just remove a bit of the X where I've got a bit too carried away there. So I can just refine that brush so it covers the gaps for me and it's not ridiculously spilt out over into the shell. So I now feel that that mask is set up quite well for me. And so what I can do then is now when I bring the exposure down, you see we're getting some nice light back into the sky. And that's balanced things up much better for me. The other thing that I can probably do is to build contrast back. I can lift the whites up a little bit. And as I built up the whites, then you'll see you get some red coming through there. And that's saying that I'm overexposing and burning out in places, and I don't want that. So I can just bring it down a little bit. So I've got all my whites back. You see I'm going right to the edge on the right-hand side of the histogram, but I haven't gone too far. And similarly, I don't think there's much room on the blacks because I'm right up to there. So we can leave that as it is. So there's my first mask. My second mask, then there's a bit of unbalance with the sky because on the right-hand side, I quite like the colors, but it's looking a bit bright for me over here on this left-hand side. So I'm going to create a new mask. This time I'm going to use a linear gradient, so similar to using a neutral density filter on your camera. And I'm just going to drag down and across here, so broadly covering the sky on the left-hand side. But what this has done is, of course, I've now covered up part of the shell. And so, whereas previously I used add to brush in the gaps, this time I'm going to use subtract and select subject. And so then I've now got rid of the selection that included the shell. And I can probably also select this. It's got a bit of the foreground in here. So I can subtract another linear gradient, and I can pull that up to like that, something like that. And so now I know that I'm only working on that part of the sky. And so I can just bring that exposure down a bit as well to bring a bit more into balance. And that's looking pretty good, I think. What I often do as well, having got the sky sorted now, to think about the foreground. And we got fairly even exposure all the way to the very front of the picture now. So I'd like just to create a little bit of a vignetting effect and put a linear gradient in there and just drag it up. Nice and, you know, graduated filter. And then just to bring down the exposure at the very bottom of the picture, just to keep the interest in the center of the picture. So final thing then to do on this, I think we're nearly there on the local adjustments, is this part of the shell here in the center is looking quite dark. So I'm going to use another mask here, and I'm going to do luminance range this time. So this is a how bright is your picture and masking out bits at various brightnesses. And I want to target something like, you see I've got a little eyedropper icon here. So if I click on that, then you see it selected the darker parts of the image now. Now, that's gone a bit too far. And so, as I said, then all of the masks have refinements, and the refinement for luminance range is along here. And we have a slider, and this is the 100% effect, and this is the feather equivalent here, the fall off as they call it. So I'm just going to take this down a little bit, so it's really only impacting the darkest parts, and probably take down the fall off a little bit as well. And you can see as I change the fall off, it's affecting other things too. So we'll see how that looks. I only want to affect the shell. So we've used the add and subtract buttons before. There's another important part of masking, and why it's not another button, I just don't know. But again, going back to the 3 dots, clicking on that, and I want to intersect the mask this time, and I'm going to choose select subject. And so it's only going to affect the shell now. So it's taken that. Yeah. And we'll see as we do that. And so I probably want to bring up the exposure, maybe bring up the shadows a bit, not too much because it'll look weird. That's looking quite good. And then down the bottom, I want to add some more clarity. And I probably want to tweak the temperature a little bit to make that bit of the shell a little bit warmer. So only very subtle changes in here. You don't want to be too heavy-handed, and I do have a tendency to be too heavy-handed with my masking. And I think that's looking a lot better. So if we go here, and so right, you see there's a little eye by the word masks up there. And so if I click on that, then I've now turned off all of the masks. And you can see that the impact of the masking that I've done is to get to this image here. So we've really made some quite substantial changes, but being very targeted at specific parts of the image. So we're now done with masking, so we can turn those off. Done with the basics things. I could do color mixing, but actually we'll leave that for later. I want to do a little bit of color grading. And some people will call this split toning. And again, this is another very powerful part of Lightroom. So you see that when I first came in, I had this pattern of 3 color wheels. Actually, that's too much information. So I'm clicked on this one, and so we're talking about the highlights now, but we'll get onto the midtones and the shadows as well. Again, there's a couple of ways of doing this, and you'll see there's this point in the center of the wheel, and there's a dot on the outside of the color wheel. The dot on the outside represents the hue. And so I'm going to see, as I move the hue slider around, then the dot moves around. And so I'm going to move the dot so it's about opposite the oranges, the warm parts of the color wheel. And then I'm going to increase the saturation of those warm tones in the highlights. And as I move the saturation, you'll see that the dot in the center, or the circle in the center, moves out. And it goes, you could be very silly with it. So, but just a little bit emphasizes some of those lovely orange tones in the sky, which is where all the highlights are. Can do the same sort of thing with the midtone. So again, move the hue to bring it to select a warm tone. And this time the midtones are going to be in the shell and some of the beach, the pebbles on the beach. And so you see they will get warmer as well. And that's quite a nice effect. The shadows will also be in some in the shell and some in the beach. And rather than doing those warm, I'd like to set up a bit of a color contrast. And so move the hue all the way around to the blue on the cold end of the spectrum. And again, bring up the saturation. You see the impact of doing too much on that. So don't do too much, but a little bit goes a long way. And so we've introduced some color grading in that. So we're on the home run now. We've done the local adjustments. We've done the color grading. We're looking at the picture, and you can see here there's a very annoying spot of dust on my camera sensor. And so we're going to get rid of that next. And so here is the healing tool. And we click on that, and there are some options for removal. We'll click on the sticking plaster. It's a good one for dealing with sensor spots. And all we need to do is to move our circle over the sensor spot, click the plus, wait a second, and it's gone. So there's probably some other sensor spots in there, but we won't spend too much time looking for them. The other distraction that's in here is these cars and the signs that are in the mid background, or the I don't want them. And it used to be prime reason for me to move into Photoshop would be to get rid of distractions. But Adobe have improved Lightroom enormously. And if we go into remove, we now see that we have, it's called early access, but there's a generative AI remove. And I need to take object aware. How am I doing this? Brushed objects. They've changed this. So brush over the car. There we go. And click apply. Come on. It's thinking. There. Like magic. I woke up this morning, I switched the computer on this morning, and it was that dreaded feeling, Lightroom has been updated. And it's like, oh, what have they done to it? And so there used to be either a brushing option or a drag and drop over an object option, draw a square over an object, and that's gone now. So we'll have to see how this goes. Right. Anyway, so let's get rid of that car, this sign, and that bit of rubbish bin or whatever it is. Right, and then apply. In my experience with this, then, for difficult cases, Photoshop is still better at removing objects than Lightroom is, but Lightroom's got a lot better. You'll see that Lightroom's done something a bit odd there. We get variations. Let's just see if any of these variations is better. Can't tell the difference. It's the worst of it has gone, so we'll leave it there and we'll keep moving on. So, as Trevor touched on, one of the important things to close this down, that's why that's come up, is sharpening. And this is what Trevor was referring to, is that by default, Lightroom applies some sharpening and broadly to everything, as you'll see. Trevor doesn't like it. I don't mind it. I think, you know, you need to explore and see what works best for you. I leave the sharpening right to the end. The easy way for me is take the radius down, so it's sharpening the finest details, take the detail all the way up, and then control what gets sharpened using masking. And so it's this slider here I'm now going to tweak. And before I move it, I'm going to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard. And you'll then see that as I move the slider, we go to a very strange black and white view. And this is showing me the white areas are showing me what will be sharpened in the masking. And so I'm moving this slider. Don't want everything sharpened. And often it's about somewhere between 70 and 80 is often the right answer for me. So pull the masking over to there. So you're only sharpening the key parts of the image, and then you can lift the sharpening up a little bit, and we'll leave it like that. And the very final thing to do on this image is I'd like to have a little bit of a vignette on here. And so I've gone to effects, and in the post-crop vignetting, then I'm just going to pull down the amount, and you'll see as it kicks in, there we go. So that's far, far too much, but just wind it back a little bit. And then we have it. And that's my picture of the seashell. And any questions on what I did with that image?
Can we see the two together?
So,
First one and this one.
So before and after.
Yes. Oh.
Quite a difference.
Quite a difference. Impressive.
Yes.
Dave, when you did the sharpening at the end, you
Yes.
used a mask. Can you intercept that mask? For example, it sharpened the shell, but it's also sharpened some element in the horizon.
That's a very good question. So on that, in this detail screen, no. But if we go back to the masking, right, and we look at, and we do select subject, this is a good question. I don't really know. So what can we do here? Detail. So just down here, we can target the shell solely and sharpen there. And you'd need to dive in and look in finer detail as to, is this an effect that's worth doing? But you don't have the radius and the amount sliders and the which of the edges gets masked in there. So the answer to your question, Vivian, is a bit yes and no.
Thank you.
No, good question.
I think that is one where it is an excellent question, and it's one that I've faced, and it's where I do two versions, one sharpened, one unsharpened, and throw them into Photoshop to then blend them as a mask. So I only sharpen the bit like the shell. It's rare that I have to do it, but it's a very good question. And it's one that I have to resort to using Photoshop to.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the bonuses for me and so I subscribe to the Lightroom, the Adobe Photographers Pack, whatever, it's CC Photographers Pack. It's £10 a month, and that gets me both Lightroom and Photoshop, and they're always updated. It's always the latest versions. Adobe put new features in 2 or 3 times a year, and sometimes it's really, really big steps that they put in. So there's generative AI. And so it just, being able to go back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop is fantastic. But almost even better is not needing to go between Lightroom and Photoshop. So putting more things in Lightroom helps me, other than remembering how to use Photoshop, because I do it so infrequently now. Right,
I have a question before you move on.
Yes.
Yeah, on the sharpening, I've never fully understood exactly what detail does. You slammed it up to 100. Can you shed some light to explain what detail?
Well, that's broadly no. So let's just see if I do there. So I'm holding down the Alt key, and as you can see, I'm moving the detail slider around. So I think my answer to that is this is possibly not the right photo to be doing it with, but as I move the detail slider, then you can see it's difficult for me to see on my screen, so goodness knows how it's coming across on Zoom. But I can just see the outline of the shell. I can see the outline of the lettering engraved into the shell. Very sorry, I don't really know. It's a formula that seems to work for me. And life's too short to go into digging into the finer details of why Adobe does the things that they do. Okay, so let's crack on. We took quite a long time on that, and I'd like to finish between 11:30 and 12 o'clock your time. So let us dive in. Which picture? Let's do these pictures next. This to this. So Trevor did a critique on this picture last month, and he made some really excellent points about it. And it prompted me to go and revisit it and question some of the things that I did. And I thought, well, actually, it's a good exercise for this workshop. And so this is, again, this is an abandoned church that's near us in deepest, darkest Suffolk. And I went there as part of the Same Place, Different Light take. And so this, I think, is sunset at the church, and there has either been a storm or there's a storm on the way in, and it was just a very dramatic sky, and it all opened up, and I got down there, and I knew that there's so much contrast in this image. So you can see, I'm got some very dark shadows and some, underexposure here, lost some of the detail in the blacks, and I've got some overexposure in the sky. So the only thing to do is to do some exposure bracketing and make this a high dynamic range image. So before we do that, I have the 3 images selected. So what we do is lens corrections. Okay, so I've got the chromatic aberration and profile corrections set up. So let's take this image, and I think we do photo merge as high dynamic range. So I take one image with the middle settings for exposure, one with exposure for the sky, and one with exposure for the foreground. And now Lightroom is pulling all those 3 together for me. If I tick on the auto settings, then you'll see, yeah, I've got everything that I want in there. But I'm not going to use auto settings because I'm going to fix all of this in a minute. So all I need to do is, right, to click OK, hopefully it's, yeah. So Lightroom is now so we're hitting the preview, and we're now getting the proper merge of these 3 pictures. And here we go. Hopefully, come back to library. There, this one. Yes, there's my, and why it's, oh, because I've got a custom order. Let's move this. There we go. That makes more sense. Right, back into develop. Okay, so we've seen some improvements from this already. A couple of other things to do before we really get started. One is, and I didn't touch on this with the seashell, and I probably should have done. You see there's lots of profiles in Lightroom, and this is the color management profile. And it's very strange. And you have some options here, and they change the range of contrast and the color saturation in there. And I will often use Adobe Landscape as my profile. And you see it's just brought up the shadows a little bit. And it's changed a little bit of the colors within there. So that's the first thing to do. The second thing is we need to, I don't like how this, because this is a wide angle lens, this is a 14mm lens, I think, or 24mm lens, and from low down, and so the building looks like it's laying flat a bit. And so I want to fix the verticals in here. So we'll go down to the transform module, but before we do that, to make it a little bit easier to see everything, then I'm just going to bring the exposure up quite a lot, and we'll take it back down again when we start developing properly. So transform, and I'm going to use the guided transform, and I'm going to say that I kind of like there, I want this wall here to be vertical, and let's just target that and drag down my line to about, it's very sensitive, about there, that. And then we look for another vertical over here, and we'll have that one. And we've done that, and that's probably done a bit too much. I like this, but that's a bit too much. So we can pick this up. Do I need to move it that way a bit? Oops. No, that was the wrong way. There. I think that looks a bit more like it's heading up properly there. So we like that. We'll go back to the basic. And what we also want to do now is we want to do a bit of cropping on this before we get started. So I don't want this building on the left-hand side, and there's probably too much happening over here on the right-hand side, and there's a bit too much grass and stuff here. So let's crop this down to something like that and take a bit out here. I'll be something like that. Maybe just slide it down a little bit more. Something like that works for me. So we've got the upright. We've done the crop. We've set the profile. So we've now can get into proper. So again, we'll start with the global, the basic tones across the whole image, the global settings. I brought up the exposure. I do want to do that, but I want a little bit less than that. So about to here, and we'll deal with this overexposure in just a minute. But I want to start to see some of the grass here in the basic tones. And so let's bring up the shadows so we can start to see more of that. So about, yeah, getting to some of this. That's bringing some more detail through. What else do you want to do? So there's a bit of scope for bringing down the blacks so we can get some of the very darkest tones back now. And as ever, I like to put in a bit of texture and a bit of clarity. And I've not quite got this tower right in my guided transform, but I'm not going to go back and redo it. I think it's still looking a bit non-vertical for me, and the whole thing is maybe a bit, anyway, I won't go back because it'll just take more time. So the foreground and the church are not looking too bad. And if we do the comparison with before, then we started with this, and now we've got to this point. So we've made a good start. But again, the most obvious thing to do is to fix the sky. And we've got a lot of overexposure in the sky, and we need to bring that down. So again, we'll do detect sky, and it's done a pretty good job there. However, it's missed a couple of things. And so the most obvious being these windows. And if I bring the exposure of the sky down and don't sort those windows out, then it'll look very strange indeed. So we need to add, we can add the object. Oh, there we go. Right. Well, maybe it's this way around. So now I have the selecting objects, and what I can do, I can brush and just paint over the window, or I can use the rectangle select, which works quite well. So here we go. So if we add here and we drag over this window, then bosh, we've now selected that. We add another object, and we'll add this window, bosh, and we'll add another object for this final window. So we've added the windows, and I think that there's just a bit around here and around here that we need to treat as if it was sky. So let's get into that, and we'll add, and I will just brush in. Bring up the feathers on that. So just brush in here so that we're taking this down. And because it's in the background at the edge of the screen, it doesn't matter if it's if we lose some of the detail in there and it gets a little bit underexposed. It's better than that than it being standing out like a sore thumb, overly bright. So we've got the sky nicely selected now, so we can bring the exposure down, and there we go. And as we bring it down, we get some beautiful colors coming in. So about something like this, perhaps. And we probably want to bring the highlights down. That's to bring out the clouds a little bit more, and possibly the blacks. What works well? No, we want to take the blacks down. Again, we're bringing in some contrast in there. So that's looking pretty good. I think that maybe we'll have a bit more blue in the sky. So we'll just take the temperature down a little bit. And again, we always like a bit of clarity. Just love the effect that's going on here with these clouds. So let's help bring them up and make them stand out a bit.
Can you show what the texture slider does? Because I think you get more detail in the clouds, the texture.
The texture, this is, so now if we overdo it, it's not, maybe, yep. And maybe we can do it quite a long way. So we'll leave it like that. We're seeing a center spot coming up there quite nicely, but we'll get rid of that later on. This up here was a flock of birds that flew through, and it's a bit of an artifact of the merge that's happening in here. The other thing just worth talking about as we're here is if we zoom in very detailed, then because we've brought up the exposure for the building, and brought down the exposure for the sky, then you can see there's a little bit of fringing around this, and it is definitely worth checking around the edges where you're doing some dramatic things. This isn't too bad. If it is objectionable, then what you can do is add a brush, nice and feather, and just add in, run down the edge here, and then that will remove the fringing. So I'll just do a bit of it along here. That's all you need to do. And that it wasn't too bad beforehand, and it's even less noticeable now. So if we put the mask overlay on, you'll see I've just run over onto the edge of the building, but it has significantly reduced the fringing in there. So we'll come out of that and we'll close that. And clearly, doing it for real, I take a bit more time and do it a bit more carefully within here. So the next thing looking at, and so just as we go back, this mask itself has made a huge difference to the image. So we've gone to here. So we're getting something that's quite respectable now. This lower window here stands out a bit. It's still a bit too bright. And although I included it in the mask, I don't like how it's distracting attention from the rest of the building. So I'm going to go back into masking to create a new mask of this object. And I'm just going to pick this window up again. And broadly, the goal is to have this lower window matching or the one above it, which is just a bit less in your face. And so what I think I will do, there's a little bit in exposure to bring down, and we'll see the mask will go. There we go. If we pull down the whites, there we go, a little bit, and maybe even the blacks too, and take out the saturation. I think more on the whites. You don't want to do too much because I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was talking to myself. I said it's just part of the sky.
Yeah, it's just, and it's it is what it is, and it's do the right thing, but it's how do I feel, and does it distract the eye from the rest of the picture? I think we'll leave it like that. The other distracting part of the sky is over here on the right hand side. It's very bright over here. And so what I will do for this is create a radial gradient and plonk it over this part of the sky here, and maybe have a bit less feather to cover that really brightest part of the sky. And what I then want to do is subtract from that the object that is the corner of this building. Don't want to affect that. And then subtract a bit of brush out this, brush out that. So there we go. And now we can take the exposure there, wait for it to kick in. There we go. There, that's looking better there now. So I think that will do us with the masking. We've got the before and after is looking quite dramatic. We've thought about the fringes on the building here. We'd probably do a little bit more on that with more time. Let's crack on. So there is the sensor spots to deal with, but we've done that in the last one. What would we do? I think there's a couple of things to do. So again, let's do that sensor spot and this grass. So just the sensor spot as it's quick. And then the AI remove. Yes, it's okay. Right. So let's just try removing that bit of grass. Apply. Yep. And what about this bunch of grass here? So that lot and that I find a bit offensive. See if it will do a good, decent job with that. Yay, that's better. So I am going to head to sharpening, but before I get there, I want to go into the calibration panel. Now this is a panel that before I started doing the research for this workshop, I'd never been in it before. I didn't know what it did. And to be quite honest, it's another one in the list of, I don't really know what it does, but I like the end result. And so often with my pictures, just before I get into the sharpening, I'll go into this calibration panel and I'll start to pull up on some of these sliders. And so the first one I'll start with, for reasons I don't really understand, other than I saw a YouTube video and liked the outcome. And so the blue saturation will have a little bit on that. Again, you can go nuts on this and it's far too much. But a little bit of a good thing is a good thing. And the red will equally have a look. And again, far too much is far too much, but a little bit is good and a little bit in the green. And so the change that's made, if I click on the eye here, so this is with those calibrations changes, and you just see there's a little bit more pop in the color that's from that. And so I will often leave, you'll see down here, that vibrance and saturation, which I used to use an awful lot, I've now just left at 0. I don't think we need to do any more to that, other than the sharpening as we did before. And possibly, you know, before I did the denoise through it's a generative AI denoise. This is just a manual, and I'll put in a little bit of luminance denoise, and then we'll get into the sharpening, and it's what I did before. Radius down, detail up, hold on the masking key, hold on the Alt key while I slide the masking slider, and I want to get some of the beautiful detail in the walls of this church and a bit in the grass. So slide it quite a long way up, and then just bump up the sharpening a bit more. And as Trevor said, click on the zoom button and just check that you're happy with the results on that. Yeah, so the before and after. So we've gone from there to there. I quite like that. I think that there might be a bit of fringing around where I put in that mask on there, so we might need to go back and do that. But we'll keep cracking on. So before I move on, any comments or questions on any of that? Right. Next picture. 2 more pictures we'll do, and we'll try and move a little bit more quickly because definitely I want to have time for Vivian's picture. So here, so not a very promising start for a picture. This is Derwent Water in the Lake District. We went up to some tarn or other for sunrise and were very disappointed. And we were driving back to well, either the hotel or wherever we were going to go next. And we saw this stream with this bridge, which you can't really see at the minute. And I loved it. And so I sort of cut camera out and tripod and a long exposure shot of the stream. And so again, if I pull up the exposure, you'll see a bit more of the detail in there. I should probably have done a bracketed exposure setting in here. But actually, so I've exposed it for the sky on the grounds that it's easier to recover shadows than highlights. And I've just lost a little bit of detail here, but I'm not that bothered about that. So I think that we can recover everything that we want from this picture. So let's dive in. Usual things: lens corrections, profile and chromatic aberration. Back to here, change the profile to Adobe Landscape because I do want to bring out the colors and the saturations in here. And let's then see, by bringing the highlights down, we'll get a bit more detail from the sky, and the shadows up, we'll start to see more of the stream and the banks of the stream. We've now got a bit of space at the top and bottom of the histogram, so I can pull the whites up because that'll make the clouds brighter and the water in the stream a bit brighter. And there's a bit of space to pull the blacks down just a little bit there. I've done that. And again, we'll pull in a little bit of texture and clarity in here. So we've made a start. I think I'd like this to be, this is early morning, a little bit past sunrise, but still I'd like a bit more warmth in the sky. So let's just increase the temperature a bit. There's some lovely, lovely tones to be had in here. And as you can see, there's still a bit of snow on the tops of the hills in the background. So we've done that. We're just getting a bit of overexposure and a little bit of underexposure, but we'll get to those in a minute. So the first thing to do is to tackle the sky. And the obvious solution of doing the select sky, it's worked really well before, but with this tree and this foliage here, it really doesn't do a good job of selecting the sky within that, and I do need to bring it all down together. So what I'm going to do is, instead of select sky, then for mask I'm going to select a luminance range, and I'm going to get something nice and bright. So looking for the brighter parts that in here, and as you see, it's now picked up the bright parts of the sky in between the branches of the trees here, which is what I wanted. I probably want to make the selection a little bit narrower here, but we'll leave that. And of course, the obvious problem that I have now is that, yeah, it's got the bright parts of the sky, but it's also selected the water. So I'm going to subtract, with using a linear gradient, all of the foreground. So it gets, you know, we're not selecting, we're not doing anything to the water or to the foreground yet. And I probably want to subtract that hill in the background there. So we'll just take that out from what we're doing, because I like some of the detail in that hill. So I'm just going to brush that out so we're not affecting that hill and the whites there. So that's a little bit better there. just run that up. So that's pretty good. So what we need to do now is we can bring the exposure down in the sky, so we get a nice bit of that. I want to bring the whites up, so there's not much room for that. So you see we're getting blowout in the clouds there. We can definitely do, how does texture work? Gets a bit close, and clarity. Oh, that's, see, there's clarity there, I think. So to Frank's point, I like a bit more clarity than texture in my clouds, but it's all personal taste. And the other thing that I like doing is, I think for the sky, let's have the sky a little bit cooler, but we're going to come back to the blue, so we won't do too much right now, because I want the clouds, I want some more orangey colors in the clouds. So where are we going next? Let us sort the foreground out. So let's do a new mask with a linear gradient, and we'll pull it all the way up here as much as we can. So we don't want to get into the sky. Do that, and I'd like, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you've made your mask of the sky, and you go to the 3 points on the right hand of that, you can make an inversion and a copy of your selection, which might be very practical for some people to show what it does and how it works.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, that's a good idea. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, let me try this. So let's undo that. So we're back to where we are with just that one mask. So I think what Frank was saying is, if we go back to this mask one, I now want to do broadly everything that isn't the sky. And so coming back to the 3 dots here, I can then duplicate and invert the mask. And actually, there you go, see? So we now have everything that wasn't the sky, which is a shorter cut to where I was getting to. And what we can do here, then, we can now bring up some more of that foreground. We can pull, we do a little bit more. We can pull the shadows up. There we go. We're getting there now. And again, definitely in this bridge, in all these rocks, there's a whole lot of texture, which we can get at. And now I want to get in, bring out some of the warmth in here. So increase the temperature. Don't go nuts, but let's just bring in some nice warm tones in here. So we've made quite a big difference. Thank you for that suggestion, Frank. Was that what you had in mind?
Yes, exactly. I think it's very useful, and you can still add and subtract with the brush on the edges to correct it, but it's quite quickly, I think.
Yep. And that's, again, it's a good point. So again, when you're doing this, let's just go over here and zoom. Then again, as we had before, there's a little bit of fringing that's happening around here. And so whether it's the inverted mask or the sky mask, then need to get the brush out and just run along those edges like I did with the church, the ruined church building before. I won't go into that now because I do want to crack on. Oops, fit in there, but do check on that. And it's one of the comments that I think Trevor made when looking at this picture, and dead right, it does spoil a really lovely image. Okay, so we're getting pretty good in this. This centerpiece of this bridge is far too dark though, so simpler mask, let's just do radial gradient and get into this bridge somewhere around there. And actually, we can probably make that a bit bigger and a bit wider. So we're getting the whole of the bridge, and we can see some more of the details in that bridge. And again, we can bring up, you know, texture and clarity just in that. And that's made a big difference there, and so giving us a, you know, a point of interest in the middle of the photo. What I also like is that we then have this pool of light we're seeing right through the bridge, and the sunlight is coming through there. And I think it's an opportunity to enhance that. There's also the dark tones within here, and actually let us right, one thing at a time. So create a new mask and radial gradient in here. So we'll make this, and then we need to tilt it at an angle and put it in here. And what I'd like to do is to have a nice, emphasize more of the warm glow. So yes, definitely put a bit more warm tones in there, and actually bring the dehaze down. Gives us a bit more of a glow. You'll see it gets a bit brighter. Dehaze and clarity down. And then because of that, I don't want it too bright in there. So just do that, and maybe even bring the saturation up, because I just want those tones nice and warm. And even what we could do is, and worth just touching on, this is probably going to be over the top for here, but you'll see down here we have a little color swatch with the X in there that says no color effect at the minute. If I click there, then I get a color panel, and I can take my paint dropper, and I can pick on a nice warm tone in there, and you'll see that as I change the saturation, then it goes to completely ridiculous, but I can dial it down, and so you just get a bit of a glow in that. So something like that, perhaps. The other thing that you might do if I had a bit more time was the very dark stones underneath the bridge. I might either brush or a radial filter or something and just bring those up, but you can probably work that out for yourself. The last thing I want to do in masks here is to get at this water. This, you know, I've got a long exposure, half-second exposure, and I've got the smooth water, and I really want to bring out some of the texture and the feeling in that. So again, create a mask, luminance range, drop it in here. So I'm targeting the water. The refinements here, so I want to really only the brightest bits in here, and probably something like that. And I want to subtract definitely all of the sky, so I don't want any of that affected by this. And actually, let's just, I don't want anything on the right-hand side, so we'll subtract all of that. And we'll also subtract these rocks here. So brush over all of those. I don't want these being changed here, because I'm going to go a bit nuts on the texture here to really bring the texture of that water, to emphasize it. And I'm probably going to make the temperature of the water a bit colder just to bring that out. And so if we look at that mask, then that's with the mask effect. And you can just see it just brings a bit more texture and a bit more of a cool look into that. So So again, that's it for masking. As before with the color grading, so bring some warmth into the shadows, just a little. Oh, sorry, no, get it right, David. Let's some cool into the shadows. And then some warmth into the midtones and the highlights. Just bring that up a bit. Looking pretty good. And we then go in again with the calibration. We can give some of the colors a bit more punch. I think in reality, you'd want to be a bit more careful than I'm being here, but you get the idea. And then in the detail, as before, do the sharpening. Hold down the Alt key as we close the masking. So we want to do some of this. So we're coming quite a long way up here. So just about this, I think, something like that. And then we can bring the sharpening up again. And so this is the end result from a picture that started like this. So yes, do exposure bracketing if you can. If you can't expose for the highlights, it's easier to do recovery from the shadows and the darker tones. But without Lightroom, then you'd really struggle to get something, or without some post-processing software, then you'd struggle out of the camera. There's a sensor spot there which I would remove again with a bit more time. But I do want to do one more photo because I put out the request for photos from members, and Vivian sent in this picture, which is a really lovely image. She found a fantastic spot on a hill looking down over a valley where the cloud and mist are really lying low all around it, and there's some you know, it's a great scene. I think that she's a little bit unlucky that, yes, she's got the fog and the mist in there, but I think she could have got a bit luckier with the lighting that was here at the scene. But let's see what we can do with this. So first things first, as always, fine lens corrections. Tick these two. And if we look at the detail, well, I think there is a little bit of noise, but I think we'll leave it as it is because time's pressing on. What I think we should do is get into the basic panel. I think we'll go for Adobe Landscape again. If we just have a look and pull the exposure up, we can see down here that there's some cars parked along the line of the road, and they're a bit distracting. So I think that the first job is, what's the crop on this? And let's help people fix on the points of interest within here. So I think, having had a bit of a play around with it, then we clearly want to remove those cars. We're not interested in those cars. We quite like the framing of this row of trees at the bottom here. Not sure that we want, so I'm unlocking the aspect ratio because I don't think we want quite so much from the side, and I don't think that we need so much from the top here. So I'm thinking something like this. You know, if I was pushed to have a rationale, I'd say, well, oh, I've got that factory tower on the third, but it's just what feels right. It's no better and no worse than that. So as you can see, then we got space on the histogram, both in the black end and the white end, and we'll try and make some use of that as we get through. So firstly, I want to try and get some more of the detail from these trees. So we'll pull the shadows up a bit to get those tree detail in, but conscious of the space that we have at the bottom of the histogram here, then we'll see if we can pull the blacks down quite a long way to bring in some more contrast in that. And you'd hope to be bringing in some detail and some texture from these clouds that we have here. So the first thing to do, I think, is then in the masking, let's see what there is in the sky. So we'll select sky, and we'll bring that exposure down a little bit. See how we go, and see if there's anything that we can bring up in clarity or texture, and there isn't a huge amount to be had in there. As I say, Vivian was really quite unlucky in the lighting conditions that she had from this fantastic location. So we'll just make it a bit bluer. And I think that what we'll also do is then bring in a linear gradient, and we'll just take down, make the sky darker at the top of the image. And so we get here, we'll just pull that down a little bit to have a bit more vignetting in there. So we've done a little bit with the clouds. It's not as much as I would have hoped we'd be able to do, but we'll see how we get with the sky rather, but we'll see where we can get to. The next obvious thing is this big clump of clouds in here, and can we get some texture and some details out of this, because this would really start to make the image much more interesting. So we could do a luminance range, and I think we will end up there, but let's start with a radial gradient, because I only want to be messing with that, but we'll make it quite a big one, and we'll pull it down here, and maybe make it even a bit broader to get all of this, and then I only want to be dealing with the clouds, so we can then intersect it with a luminance range and drop in the clouds, and that's got more or less what we wanted, I think. So let's see if we could do that. And yes, we will pull the exposure down a little bit, but we'll also see if we can get anything through contrast, and as we pull up the texture, if we do too much, it gets a bit weird. So just want to walk the line in there, and in clarity, there's a little bit coming through there. And the other thing that we can do is we can push the whites up a bit and see if there's blacks that will come down. And all we're trying to do is trying to sort of pull out some of the texture and detail in those clouds. And we've done not too bad. So if we switch this mask off, that's without the mask. And then with the mask, we've definitely made, you know, a difference and have a bit of an impact in there. But I'd like to do a bit more. And if the light won't play ball, then yeah, I'm a believer in, well, you can always cheat. So let's bring in a bit of sunshine on this. And so if we create another radial gradient, but we start it off screen, and we bring it, and it's quite a thin gradient, something like that. And we probably want a bit more feather in it, because we don't want to be ridiculous, and actually possibly even but all the way down, and then we can have it coming down there and into there. And now if we do that, we can feather 100%, yeah, about that. So if we bring the exposure up here, so we're getting a brighter band in here without being too much ridiculous. And we'll take the blacks down to try and keep the detail that we have. And if we bring the temperature up, there we go, and we're getting a bit of overexposure. So we'll take that back down. And so we've just brought a bit of a warm band in on the edge of this picture. And it's easier to see when I take it away. Oops. So that's without. And now bring it back. Then there's just that little bit of a glow within there. And I think that made a little bit of a difference in that. And then the final thing I'd like to do with this picture is we've done quite a bit of luminance range work. I don't think we've picked a color range mask yet. So let's these green hills then quite washed out, and let's see if we can do a little bit to bring out the greens in these hills. So over eyedropper with the green there, that's too much. And the adjustment here is this refine slider. So let's pull this down. I don't want to do too much with the trees. So pull it down, or pull it down quite a long way. We can then, we just subtract with the brush. It's going to be quickest. So we don't want to do any of that. This lot here. Probably not that there either. So just take that lot out, and then we're dealing with these. What we want to do here is just to bring some of the greens up. And so we can use the tint slider in that just to bring a little bit more emphasis on the green colors in there. That's it for masking. Let's very quickly, so I've done color grading on most of the pictures so far. I've not done too much, I've not done anything in the color mixer. And if I try to explain the difference between all of the various ways of changing colors in Lightroom, I don't think that I could. But this is one of the global settings that you can use. It's definitely one of the options. And so let's have a little bit of a work on this green. So what do we like in that? Would we like that green to be a little bit darker? So we're looking at hue colors here, and we can change the hue of any of the color bands within this. The greens, I mean, just have a play and see what works and what doesn't. That might be a little bit. And so this is the shade of the color is the hue, the luminance, of course, is the brightness, and the saturation is the richness of the color. And I think we're pretty close there. We might just do a little bit on the green saturation there. So we're pretty much at the end. I think that that radio tower, then let's just remove that as a final detail. Spot healing. We probably don't need the generative eye. Just remove that. Let that go. No, let's. Sometimes it's just difficult, right? Let's undo. You try and be clever, and it doesn't always work for you. Is that going to go? Yeah, it's left a bit of an artifact on there. So you might say, well, we could take it into Photoshop and definitely remove it. We'll leave it because time is marching on for us. So then the last thing, again, some sharpening in here. Where's the detail tab? We'll do as we did before. So radius down, detail up. In with the masking. We don't want to do too much. You'll see there, because of the clouds, then there isn't a huge amount to sharpen in that. And so there we are. And if we then go, come out of that, close that. And so the before and after on the picture, then you'll see that, we've pulled out some of the hills and the trees in here. We've got a little bit more detail out of the clouds. And personally, I like the little bit of, fake sunlight coming in here on the left-hand side. Vivian, how do you feel about what I've done with your picture? Oh,
I like it very much. Absolutely wonderful. Like you said, I wish I came a little bit earlier, but I have also some photographs that the mist gone down a little bit.
yeah.
And showed a little bit more details in the center of the picture. But the transformation is fantastic. And thank you very much for the tutorial. Brilliant.
Would you like me to send the JPEG of my processing for you?
Please, if you can. Please.
I'll do that.
It's really,
before we finish,
really
does anyone else have any questions or comments? Okay, well, so I hope that was useful for folk. There's times when I went very quickly. The time has absolutely whizzed by at this end. I hope, if not a detailed how-to, then you've at least got a flavour of what can be done and some of the power of Lightroom. Definitely, I'm not saying everybody should Lightroom. It's clearly not the right thing for everyone. But I think it is worth spending some time with your pictures after clicking the shutter button, because there's things that you just can't do in camera. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Dave.
Thank you. It was
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Really great.
Thank
If we can have some more of that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. That we should do more of those sort of things. Trevor, Dave, Photoshop. It's always very interesting. It's always very. I realize I have an older version of Lightroom and
Me too.
Photoshop, I suppose, but it's very, very interesting how they're developing. Yeah, very interesting how they're going.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And as you'll have gathered from the
Dave has
comments,
hung this.
Sorry, Trevor.
Sorry. Dave has hung this on Lightroom, but apart from bringing his images in and was working under the develop tag, everything that is under the develop tag is equally accessible from Photoshop. So whether you start with Lightroom or start with Photoshop, 100% of what Dave has shown today, although I admit the HDR bit was a little bit easier, is equally accessible from Photoshop as it is from Lightroom.
Yeah, but Photoshop's far more complicated.
Yeah, I think
it's exactly the same start. It's exactly the same start. When you open the Camera Raw in Photoshop, it automatically opens in Adobe Camera Raw, and that is exactly the same interface as what Dave has just shown. Provided you got the latest Photoshop.
I think that Lightroom, being a photographer, Lightroom somehow is simpler. Yeah, it's more direct. It's more just the photograph. Yeah, whereas Photoshop is more everything. Yeah.
AI.
I disagree with you, Rod. Every single thing that Dave has done today has been done in the module Adobe Camera Raw. Adobe Camera Raw is shared between Photoshop and Lightroom. If you go into Lightroom and press the Develop tab, you open Adobe Camera Raw. If you're in Photoshop and just double click opening, it automatically opens by default in exactly the same position. And you have all the same processing.
I must admit, I don't know.
I think the point Trevor's making, it doesn't matter. Whichever works for you, go with that. And it's more important that you build familiarity with something and that you feel comfortable in moving between the various panels and with having a workflow for your photos. And it doesn't matter really whether it's Lightroom, whether it's Photoshop and Camera Raw, whether it's on one photo, whether it's Affinity, whether it's, you know, any of the other things that are in there. You can do all or almost all of what I did in those. Just, I think it is my point is, it is worth, for certain sets of photos, or for most photos, spending a bit of time in improving what's come out of the camera with whatever you're comfortable using.
Yep. Well, thank you again, Dave. Thank you. It was very interesting.
I hope it was useful for folk.
Thank you very much.
Useful.
Thank you.
It will be
was a superb presentation.
This is all recorded and will be on Facebook and on the website very soon. So you can go over it as many times as you want. What you missed.
Yeah.
What did he do? And also there's a ton on YouTube. YouTube is your friend for finding out how to use any of this stuff, and you'll probably come across one of the guys that I use. Oh, that's why Dave does radius down to 0 and detail up to that, and then to that. Say, well,
Dave, whom do you use mainly?
A guy called Christian Morler or something like that. I'll send you the link. Or put the link up in Facebook or something. So yeah. And then you find that, oh, these guys do it much better than Dave did anyway. They make money for it on YouTube though. Yeah.
Yes, but with you we can ask questions.
This is true. Yeah, and do ask questions. Yeah, Dave, you're talking about this. What did you? Yeah, then I'll help if I can.
Thank you.
Okay.
And lots
Better luck
about
with the light
masking.
next
Thank
time
you.
you go to Mamtor, Vivian.
Sorry?
Better luck next time you go to Mamtor with the light.
Yeah.
You know, when I went there, the first time was muddy and I slipped just as I was covered with mud. But the first thing I did is hold my camera.
Quite right.
Never mind my legs or my knees. It's the camera. Fabulous place.
Thank you, Dave.
Very
Okay.
close to me.
Anybody got anything else?
Thank you very much and
Thank
see you
you.
soon.
Thank you,
See you
Dave.
soon. Yeah. Thanks, then.
Thanks,
Thank
Dave.
you. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye then.
Bye.